Hello everyone, and welcome to another chapter analysis video. I am Pandan, and today we're going to talk about Battle Before Dawn, chapter 26, Hector Hard Mode of FE7, chapter 24, Allywood Mode. So Battle Before Dawn is one of the most infamous chapters, not only in just FE7, but I would say in Fire Emblem in general. It's one of those chapters that gets a really bad reputation. That's not wholly undeserved. I personally always really liked this chapter, but there's quite a lot that could be improved about it. And I think because this chapter gets that bad reputation, I think that it discourages hack creators or fan game makers to make chapters like this as a result. However, I believe that you can take this concept that's present here and improve on it. And so I want to talk a little bit more about it. So let's analyze this map. And let's talk about what Battle Before Dawn does well and what Battle Before Dawn could improve upon. To set up the scene for those of you unfamiliar, in Battle Before Dawn, your party arrives at a mansion on the night of an assassination attempt on the heir to the burned throne, Zephiel. So at this point in time in the story, Hector, Allywood, and Lynn are helping out Queen Helen of Bern, and they kind of catch wind of this assassination attempt and are sent to rescue Zephiel. Meanwhile, Jafar and Nino, who were sent to actually do the assassination, bail, and then the rest of the Black Fangs show up to try and finish the job, and that's where you come in. So, you as the player, you're starting outside and must work your way into the fog to save not only Zephiel, but also Jafar and Nino. And the reason you want to save Jafar and Nino is one, because they're both recruitable, but two, having them talk to each other unlocks a guide-in chapter where you can get some loot, most specifically the Fell contract, which allows you to promote your thief, which is the only one in the game. Locking the thief promo item behind this requirement is pretty lame, in my opinion, especially because so much can go wrong and the player might be inclined to skip it. Personally, I know that when I was a kid, I probably, the first like 4 or 5 times I played FE7, I stopped at Night of Farewells just because I couldn't figure it out. I mean, I was like 12, give me some credit. Eventually, when I beat it, I was so satisfied, but it took me a long time to figure it out as a kid, and I restarted it again and again and again just to get back to that point. And so having it be this requirement is also a bit tough. So with the overview out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about the map. So we're thinking holistically here. Bern is the most powerful and militaristic nation in Alib, so it makes sense that where their prince resides is both large and complex. You have split paths, a left side and a right side. I like that Jafar and Nino are each on one side, so you have incentive to go down both these paths. There are chests to get on both sides. There are thieves that are going to come get the chests. Great. Classic, good split maps. They're not perfectly symmetrical. Lot to like with that. It encourages you to want to create and swoop down the left and right side to achieve all these objectives. But the fog makes it a bit harder to blitz through, and so you have to play carefully if you don't want to die. And the fog, I think, this is one of those chapters where I don't really know how much the fog adds, because the fog ends up being a detractor for a lot of other elements of this map. And so we'll get into that a little bit more later. But when it comes to just like the way that this map is laid out, I really like that it's ambitious. I like that it's challenging. I like that the defense point is far away from where you start, and so you're encouraged to rush to get there. And that's something that FE7 just doesn't really do. However, that's really where my praise for this map ends. Besides the good anti-turtle and having a good reason to split and just being at a climactic sort of narrative point with Jafar and Nino, because who we've been seeing for the past few chapters, and then fighting Ursula, who is one of the 4 fangs you've seen a couple of times throughout the story. Like, there's a lot of really good ingredients here. But let's talk about where this map starts to fall apart. The biggest thing here is that the RNG is just unrelentless. It's unrelenting. And it's complete just like ability to screw things over. And what I mean by that is a lot can go wrong with it. And that's just going to be an issue with soft timers in general. So a soft timer being this type of timer that the player has that isn't strictly turn-based. So while like this chapter has a hard timer of 15 turns that you need to survive for, there's a soft timer which is, can Zephiel survive? Can Jafar survive? Can Nino survive? Etc. And that's going to fluctuate by a couple of turns depending on rolls of the dice. Now, some people try to avoid green unit maps like this altogether because of that element where things can go perfectly wrong. But if you design well enough, you can avoid that. Like, Nino shouldn't be facing crit there because Nino can get 2 hit by getting crit at a 2%. And so you can lose Nino quite quickly and lock yourself out of the chapter. And so where the RNG becomes really troublesome here is that things can happen that are completely outside of the player's control. Zephiel can die, and you can play perfectly and Zephiel can die. You can play perfectly and Nino can die. You can play perfectly and Jafar can die. And I don't think that's fair. I think that it's one thing if you play too slow and the game, with its soft timer tells you, okay, you need to get to these particular points by these specific turns. And if you don't get there roughly by this time, you will probably lose. And it's kind of like this very clear, how do I put this? This clear like timeline to get to that point. And this chapter doesn't really have it because there's such wide fluctuation for when things can go wrong. And it's one thing to punish the player for playing too slowly and then they lose the green unit. Like, that's fine. And I think that that's good. But when it's completely random and there's no way the player could feasibly get to that point to defend that unit by the time they die, that's not cool. Because then it's just like, it's completely up to chance. And a lot of elements of this chapter are completely up to chance. Zephiel getting hit on the pillar and dying, completely up to chance. Jafar's AI taking him to random places on the map that are more or less advantageous to him, completely up to chance. The damage thresholds that trigger his healing AI, completely up to chance. And so what are some things that you can do to mitigate this? One is positioning. Where do you position these units and what units do you position around them? That's probably like the simplest and most straightforward thing. This chapter just like throws a ton of reinforcements at you and it's pretty haphazard like where they move. And Jafar's AI, it's always different. Like, I've never played this chapter and Jafar react the same way. He always goes for different things. The hit rates are in such a place and the damage outputs are in such a place where like if the coin doesn't flip in your favor, you're taking huge damage and like 2 or 3 unlucky hits and you're dead. So a better way to do this is instead of relying on like coin flip hit rates, it's to make the enemies do a prescribed amount of damage should they hit and making it, likely and easy to understand. Like, see here, 53% at 13, like, that's fine, but when there's like 10 dudes who can all do that, it's such a toss-up. Every outcome's going to be so different, it's impossible to plan for. And just Jafar is facing so many enemies at each point, it's just a little ridiculous. Like, Jafar could very easily die right here on this turn, but I have to get lucky and miss a bunch of 50s. Nino can die to a crit. Zephiel can die to some hits as well. It's something that you just need to work on with pacing, right? Like, when does the map pick up and when do you say as a designer, okay, you should be here by this point. If not, then you deserve to have a harder time. And I think that that's fair. But again, it's about pacing. It's about understanding when that right threshold is. And this chapter doesn't really have that. Like, Jafar can lose, I think, as early as like turn 2. And it's like, there's no way you're getting down there by turn 2. There's absolutely no way. So again, with soft timers like this, make sure that you do the requisite testing to understand how many turns it'll take for the player to get there, and then adjust the pressure that you're putting on these green units or these side objectives accordingly so that you can create a fair experience. In addition, setting up the enemies in such a way that it minimizes the chance for weird crits or unforeseen early death. It's always going to be a risk with green unit, no matter how unlikely, but you want to put it in such a way where it's less likely. The other thing about this chapter that's really unfair is the fog. And while I normally like fog chapters, this chapter does a few things in the fog that are really crappy. The first being Maxime, who's easy enough to suss out early, and so I don't think it's as egregious, but if you don't know that he's there, he's really strong, like deceptively strong. And part of this is because he's one of the few bosses that actually gets his hard mode bonuses in FE7, and so he auto levels like a generic with his like bases and growths, and so he becomes like an exceptionally buff boss. And you saw earlier he hit Farina for like 22 damage. That's really high for FE7. And having a paladin charging out of the fog doing that much damage, like look at those stats. Look at those stats, man. Like he's a beefy lad. And so while he's positioned in such a way that you could theoretically see him with like a torch and thief, it's not necessarily something that will be completely fair. And so he can charge out and really just mess up your day without you really having much recourse for it. And while I'm saying like, I'm not saying don't put paladins in the fog. I'm saying like the difficulty of the things that you put in the fog needs to be at a level that the player can expect. Because if the player can't see it and feasibly calculate it out, the player is going to have to assume that, what data do I have? Okay, I have to look at what enemies I can see in this chapter and what are the general quality of the chapter before to determine what is the general quality of the enemies here. And when you have an outlier like Maxime charging out of the fog, it feels very unfair. If Maxime was not in the fog, I would say, sure, like you could plan this out a lot better. But because he's in the fog and because he's so much stronger, that's a problem. More egregiously, in the fog, you have Ursula. And Ursula, her problem in the fog is that she has bolting. She's a powerful Valkyrie with a siege tome. And so you can accidentally step into her range and not realize it and just lose. So if you're playing this blind, you don't have a good way to suss out where she is or even know where she is. And if you're playing Hector mode, you assume for the first time that she's where she was in the Eliwood version of the chapter, which is the bottom left. But in Hector, she's in the bottom right. This is never clearly telegraphed at all. And one of the things that I like to do in fog chapters with bosses is do like one of those like little like cursor hovers over where the boss is in the fog to give the player an idea, so they know where to go. But when you have a boss with bolting in the fog that the player would have a real hard time seeing, that's just not fair, because you could just walk into a space and have no idea. Siege weapons are one of those things that you have to give the player visibility into, because it's otherwise just like you're moving slowly and carefully and you don't realize that you stepped into this like invisible trigger point, which is a really crappy way to lose. And it just comes down to trial and error. So again, like while I like what some of this chapter does with gameplay story integration, it just needs more testing to make it more fair. And the RNG is really the most egregious piece of it. Now, when it comes to just like general chapter flow, I'd say turn by turn, this chapter generally does okay. The first few turns for the player, they're a bit slow as you move through the entrances, and then it's followed by a few turns of action and then a wind down. For me, like one of the things that I really dislike about this chapter is that for an RNG-oriented map, pecking the midsection with the most action is poor design. Because not only are you losing to something random kind of late into the map after you've played a few turns, but then you have to replay a bunch of boring turns to get back to that point. Like the first few turns are not very exciting. So the chapter's just like pacing is just a bit off as well. And I really do think it's important that like the first few turns of a chapter are generally the most difficult and most action-packed, because those are the turns the player is going to play over and over again if they lose. And if your first few turns are a bit of a snooze, you're just moving, then it's like, why am I not just save stating like 3 turns in and continuing from where the action starts, where my movement will have a real impact on what's happening? So it's something to consider as well. And like, while I appreciate that from a narrative standpoint, it makes sense that most of the action's happening inside and you're starting outside, as a designer, do more to make your first turn more engaging. So just something to consider. Slow start and a heavy middle with a lot of RNG just makes for a frustrating experience, and you're just wasting the player's time. From a replayability standpoint, I think that because this map is a split and you can take units down different formations, I think it's one of those maps that offers a lot of replayability because you have to figure out how to optimize with the different unit mix and strategy. And given that it's late in the game, you'll probably have a very different army each time you play it. And for me, like, I both dread and look forward to this map. While I hate losing because of the RNG elements and having to replay again in that moment, I do like the challenge of rushing the map and figuring out how to beat it in as few turns as possible. So you're getting some different options on how to approach, but the high RNG reliance really just makes this chapter more of a chore if you are unlucky or new to the series in general. I remember very distinctly a few years ago, I had a friend who was playing Fire Emblem 7 for the first time, new FE player. He was playing this on normal mode, and this was the chapter he got stuck on. And I had to help him beat it. And it makes sense. Like, this is a chapter that's really discouraging because it's so unfair. And it just makes you question as a new player, like, can I do this? And you can, but it just requires a bit of luck and just kind of knowing what you're doing. So what would I, again, do to make this chapter better? I think in the context of Battle Before Dawn specifically, I would probably get rid of the fog or fix Maxime's stats and get rid of Ursula's bolting. I would reposition Nino and Jafar in such a way where the flow of enemies they each face are steadier and that the quality of the enemies they face lead to less randomness. Like, look how many enemies Jafar has to fight at these hit rates and that damage. Like, he's not a tank. He's an assassin. He shouldn't be fighting this many enemies at once. And so because he can run around, it can mess up when you recruit him. It can mess up when he dies. Like, I think it would make more sense if Jafar was like stationary, like choking a point that protects Zephiel. Similarly, I think Nino should be doing the same. Because of where they're each placed, while it's great to encourage the split, it also just leaves up more to chance and more can go wrong, which I'm not crazy about. Like, you can rush it in physic, which is nice, I guess. So I think repositioning them, making that element more fair would be good. Making it so Zephiel doesn't die in like a single hit, I think is a good idea too. Especially if he's going to be facing combat this early. Like, and that's one of the things, right, with the RNG. Like, if Jafar doesn't go for the fighters that are near Zephiel, they're going to go for Zephiel. It's like the chances of Zephiel getting protected are also up to a chance, which isn't great. So something to consider as well. Maybe generic green units guarding him would have been helpful to kind of like sponge the hits and kind of lead to Zephiel. That might have been better. So probably wouldn't work thematically in this map. Like, this map does feel like a Thracia map with like how heavy it leans into gameplay story integration at the expense of player experience. If you're making maps like this, I hope that this was helpful in kind of just like laying out like how you could make this type of map better. And I think Battle Before Dawn, like, it has a lot of cool ideas. It's very unique for an FE7 map, especially. Just the execution just makes it really frustrating and dicey. Literally just rolling the dice each time you play. There's so much that can go wrong. If you're playing like a hard Iron Man, this is a great chapter to lose at because it's totally out of your control. And so with these types of soft timers, again, you want to make sure that it's enough of a soft timer, or that there's just like as little variance as possible in that soft timer, and that it's feasible for a player who's playing aggressively and doing the right things to save the objective. If you make it so that the player can't get there before anything bad happens, that's not really fair. You're just setting it up for failure. There's just so much that can go wrong in this chapter. And a lot of the time it isn't your fault. And that's really frustrating. So, I know I've rambled on for quite a bit about this. I hope that this was helpful for you as you're thinking about these types of maps. I think soft timers have a lot of potential. I think this type of chapter has a lot of potential. It's all just about how you execute it. And yeah, it really just comes down to execution. Execution and fairness are going to make these types of chapters work. And kind of similar to what I said in the escape video, you just need to test it a lot. Soft timers require testing. It's a lot, even hard timers require testing. But just keep these things in mind, and I'm sure you'll be able to make a chapter better than Battle Before Dawn. Because it's a great concept, poor execution, makes it a rough experience. So keep these things in mind, guys, and I'll take it from there. I'm sorry, I just wanted to see what happened in Berlinus. All right, see you guys. Thanks.